welcome to the Crafted Conversation with me, Marcus Sharrod, where we give consideration to the art of performance and development in the classroom or instructional environment on the coaching field for sports coaches, and consider a culture of performance where conversations will explore anything from instructional methods, teaching and learning, which is informed by educational and cognitive psychology, motivation theory, cognitive biases, designing programs of learning, the use of feedback and assessment, and also consider group dynamics and performance as well as individual performance. None of this can be explored without the lens of identity and storytelling and generating a sense of belonging within the cultural performance in which we exist. So, without further ado, we continue with today's crafted conversation. Welcome back to the Crafted Conversation, where today I have Bradley Busch with me. Bradley is a chartered psychologist and a director of the company Inner Drive, who I have used on many occasions in my day-to-day life as an educator. Inner Drive's job and mission is to kind of dissect research-led cognitive science, cognitive psychology, educational psychology, and package that in an accessible way to instructors. And I say instructors because Inner Drive absolutely are not focused solely on the education sector. They've seen a lot of success in elite sport and being able to apply those concepts to any learning environment, because of course, as we say at the Crafted Concept, learning is learning is learning. We need to learn, whether that's in our professional workspace, elite sport, in the classroom, as a professional, and the application of these sciences is essential to break down some really deep-rooted myths and to signpost us in the direction of the greatest success in imparting learning. In doing so, Bradley has been lucky enough to work, as so many of us wish that we could, in the highest highs of Premier League football. And he actually has a footballing background himself, having been a psychologist, sports psychologist with both Crystal Palace and Watford previously, before moving into a lecturing career that led him to Inner Drive. Bradley, great to have you with us. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
A short pause in today's crafted conversation to talk a little bit about Keynote Educational, partner of the show. Keynote have been for the past 25 years the market leader for professional development for educators across the country. Keynote are the trusted provider of continuous professional development courses, conferences, in-school workshops, external examination marking support, and student revision courses. Their repertoire of speakers is extensive and impressive. I myself have and continue to support Keynote with courses across leadership and physical education. Their impressive range of courses covers the whole of the national curriculum, as well as looking at specific leadership within school settings, and those are even extrapolated out to the academic, to the co-curricular, and to the pastoral. So for further information, just head over to www.keynoteeducational.co.uk. Keynote, I'm sure, will be able to provide you with whatever it is that you need in the educational training environment.
So as we always start, I am the Crafted Concept, and this is the Crafted Conversation. Bradley, what do you consider to be your craft?
Oh, good question. I think the best way I describe, my craft is I'm a research translator. Is we do our best here in the Drive to illuminate research, which means finding key studies, highlighting them to people, and packaging them in a way that is useful and understanding. Generally, one of my biggest frustrations is I generally believe when it comes to learning, there's absolute gold in the research. But frustratingly, a lot of the times it's behind paywalls. If you can get behind the paywalls, often it's hard to know where to find them. And even once you find papers, sometimes they're written in a really psych-heavy jargon that they just don't really make sense to the people who could benefit them the most, i.e. educators, coaches, people in the business world. And so, yeah, our job is to translate and illuminate research. We think if you can use research to inform your judgment, people make better decisions, they learn faster, and ultimately perform better. Thank you.
Because as we know, those you mentioned it there, published research is and has to be designed to be a certain way, and the way in which it is packaged is fairly inaccessible. Certainly for the busy day-to-day professional who doesn't have time to work through a 30-page, 25-page journal article. So to be able to dissect that and illuminate is a really valuable thing. I wonder, other than people's time, which is the most common response, what do you think the biggest barriers are to accepting that there may be a different way or an alternative approach or an approach to accommodate?
Yeah, it's a really good question because there's many different answers, I think. I mean, one is time. It's hard to stop doing what we're doing when we're on the kind of hamster wheel and you feel like you've got to just keep going. The other one that's really interesting, there's a few psych biases, like cognitive biases, I think, that get in the way of us changing our thought process and our behaviours. One of them is kind of the sunk cost fallacy. So I've spent the last 20 years of my career doing X. For me to stop doing that now means I have to, on some level, acknowledge that what I have been doing might not have been optimal. And that's a really hard thing to confront, especially because a lot of us, our work or our craft, is very much tied into our identity. So let's say my identity is I'm a good person and I want to do great things to help students learn faster and footballers kick a ball better. And my whole identity is tied up into helping people. If I then read something that conflicts with what I've been doing, not only do I have to change potentially my practice, I have to kind of go, does this mean I actually haven't been helping that person? Am I not the sort of person that I thought I was? And is there actually a chance what I have been doing has even been hindering and actually getting in the way? And that's the last thing I want to do. So you're not just having to change your practice. Some people, improving means reshaping your actual whole identity. And that's a really hard thing to do. The other thing I think I'd probably add on, the other bias that's worth noting is probably this idea of like sort of confirmation bias. Like we're all prone to this. We seek out evidence that confirms our belief. And I do this just as much as anyone, I try not to. You know, you read a research paper that confirms your view and then you go, brilliant, I'll spread that message. That's great. That confirms that, you know, I'm doing good. And when you read something that doesn't, and it challenges you, you go, but I bet the methodology was wrong, or you know, the context must be so different. You try and find holes in it because we want to, that combination of sunk cost but also confirmation, we want it to keep doing what we're doing. And that's the thing we actually seek out. We curate our timelines on social media to reinforce that. And therefore that makes change really hard.
Yeah, I mean, social media is built on people's confirmation bias, right? That's the algorithm. That sunk cost fallacy, if I could dig into that, what I'm really interested in, because we have a vested interest in two very similar worlds, in education and in elite sport.
Yeah.
Which has a deeper rooted sunk cost fallacy, the educator or the football coach?
Absolutely, it's the sports world. It's not only is it so much the sports world. I mean, the curious thing about sport, and let's take football as the example, because I think that's one thing we both have in common. The very nature of it, because it's a low-scoring sport, it means obviously one outcome, one event on the pitch can completely change the whole narrative. So take other sports, like if you play tennis, for example, if you're the best player for 99% of the match, you're probably winning that match. But at the end of each set, it resets to 0-0 for the next set, and you kind of go again. Whereas football, you can be the best team for 99% of the game, but because it's low scoring, that one free kick, that one corner, changes the whole outcome, and therefore changes the narrative. And so the narrative can either be, you know, we're always bottlers, we always lose it in the last minute, we never take our chances, or the narrative can be, you know, if you keep plugging away at the last minute, it will fall for you. And both those things can be said sometimes about the same match. You know, my favourite example is, you know, I used to have this belief, I won't name the player, but about 10 years or so ago, watching the Premier League with my dad, and we had the most opposite view of the same player. So I loved it that he created chances. So I was going, creating chances is the hardest part. He's getting to good positions. That's really difficult. He keeps doing that. He'll score loads. And my dad would he didn't rate that player, would always highlight the chances he missed. He's not clinical. He's not a good finisher. And so we'd watch the same event, and we would go away, both of us, confirming that our belief was right and that what we saw was true, as opposed to our version of reality, our framing of it. And so I think that's sunk cost, because sport is so much more outcome based. In education, you teach a lesson. If it doesn't go well, you can reflect on it and you can go again. Whereas in sport, you lose a few games on the bounce and you get fired.
Yeah.
And the process often gets thrown out the window when people panic for short-term outcome. So I think that's much more tied into elite sport, that sunk cost.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So where's the change come about? What's the juncture by which individuals like yourself and me have been able to have more of a voice in the elite sports sector? Is it the rise of the kind of director of sport role, so that there's more of an identity, more of a narrative, as you've already described, that runs through an organization, rather than it just peaking and troughing with the firing and hiring?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that. I mean, the whole narrative has changed. So 10, 15 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago when I left university, so I did my master's thesis on the fear of failure in academy football players and how they cope with fear of failure. And to give an example, so I wrote to all 92 clubs saying, I've done this thesis, I will come in for free, and I'll present to your coaches and they can kind of be upskilled. So I wrote to all 92. 2 of them got back to me. One being Sunderland, which just happened to be the furthest away from my house at the time. Yeah, so I went up there and did a presentation for them. The other one was Birmingham, who I then went basically for one of the, and the only reason I was there was for the academy coaching staff, one of the staff, to basically tell me he thought sports psychology was nonsense and it's all just fluff and there's nothing to it. And yet you fast forward now to 10 or 15 years after that, and you kind of see every football club is advertising for an academy sports psychologist. So we have seen a huge shift in that behaviour. Why has that shift happened? Partly, I think it was just inevitable. You look at people like Wenger, who came in and really accelerated nutrition, as an example. People at the time like Bolton and Sam Allardyce, being much more with match analysis. And so they basically went through each domain of sports science. So we do physical conditioning, do nutrition, we do performance analysis. The last one that was inevitably left was sports psychology. Now, it's funny, at the time, when I was working with, I did some work with Team GB Paralympians, and we'd laugh because you get these stories in the papers, and it's like, footballer admits to seeing shrink. And we'd kind of go, sports psychology, for what we're doing, that's just Wednesday. It's almost like this non-event. And so I think historically football, with its roots and how the game developed, was traditionally quite alpha male, typically working class, stiff upper lip, don't complain, grin and bear it. So
deferential.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny often, I think, how quite submissive a lot of footballers are.
Yeah.
People often think they're not, but actually they're told what to do for a lot of their lives. And therefore, the perception, even though this isn't what the job is, but the perception of talking about your feelings was seen as not as a sign of strength, but a sign of weakness. And I think London 2012 probably helped with that in the UK, in terms of the Olympic model of support around an athlete. And so now, not even are you having, or clubs having a sports psych, the Olympic model is often you have a team around the player, around the athletes. And so it's now fairly common, and we've done this with a number of players. A number of the Premier League players that I work with, I don't even know if their clubs know we work with them, but they have their own nutritionist, their own chef, they have their own strength and conditioning coach, and they have their own psych. And that's just become inevitable as the game becomes more elite and more professional. It seeks advantages. And for a long time, this was just a massive untapped resource. And I think it's just catching up.
Yeah, absolutely. What does illuminating educational psychology, cognitive science, what does that look like in practice in those environments?
In a sport environment?
Mm.
So it's a good question. One thing, so there's two things. There's one is what is the content and then how is it delivered?
Mm.
So in terms of the content, one of the best things you can get from cognitive science is a better understanding of how people learn. And I think if you understand how people learn, they can perform better and they can make improvements quicker. And so therefore, it's in clubs' interest to know about how do my athletes learn. So how do I structure team meetings, for example, to enhance learning? Because there's a lot of information that you actually have to give in a very short amount of time. One of the tasks that we were set by someone actually within the FA was for the last World Cup. Someone there reached out to us, asked about, we only get these players for a few days before we actually fly out. In theory, what does the research say around how can we give them key information for upcoming matches in that short amount of time so we don't have a big build-up until mid-season? Cognitive science can help with that. And I think as coaches, all coaches are really good teachers. And so therefore, to be a good teacher, you have to know how learning works. So I think that's the first part, is the content is, if I teach you how people learn, you can accelerate performance.
Yeah.
Then the second question is the format. So in terms of what does illuminating look like, I will never in my life go into a sporting environment and tell a coach, this randomized control trial suggests that we can get an effect size of 0.43, and that's going to be very good, because there's already this perception that you're battling against of academic, different contexts, don't belong here in our setting. What does that actually look like and mean for me? Whereas a simple thing such as, is it better, say you're doing set piece analysis, is it better to get the players to watch the opposition set piece and then you re-watch it with them and you narrate it with them bit by bit after they've watched it once? Or should you be talking to them while they're watching it for the first time to tell them what they see? Now that is something they go, well, I want to know the answer to that because we do that.
That's what we do.
All the time. So you have to work out, what it is that people want to need to know. How can you present it in a way that's meaningful to them? But then I also think the last part, which is quite important, is it's really important not to overstep. I see this a lot in the psychology domain of people, because they know something about one thing, they think they know stuff about other things. So I think we get credibility with the players we work with is, I never talk now about tactics or technique or, when should they close down a man, because I might have an opinion on that as a fan, but I'm just not qualified. And so therefore, if they spot some of my flaws in that stuff, they then start doubting the other stuff that I am qualified in. I remember one example, always kind of sticks with me. I was working with a player from Man United. I was talking to him about one of his teammates who I said I thought was really good at closing down players. And what I meant by that at the time was he did it with good intensity. That's the thing I liked. Whereas he kind of rolled his eyes at me, the player, and said he didn't think they were very good at closing down a player because he said they kept closing down in straight lines. Whereas he said as a striker, in his opinion, you wanted to close down on a curve. That way the centre-back, by doing on a curve, you cut out the pass to the full-back. And I was going, see, and that's just like one tiny nugget. And I was going, so he's clearly way more of an expert in that than me. So I shouldn't offer an opinion on that stuff. I should stick to the stuff that I'm qualified to talk about. And I think that way you gain credibility in these circles.
Yeah, you talk as you're saying that, I'm smiling to myself, Bradley, because that exact piece of coaching instruction has just, you talk about affective learning context. I am currently age sort of 14, 15 on a cold November evening on an AstroTurf being taught that session to close down on an angle. So thanks for that reminder. Yeah, big shout to Shrewsbury Towns Academy. Thank you. What I'm really interested and curious about then is if I reflect to you areas that I have observed in an elite sport environment that I think can benefit most effectively, most quickly, it's team instruction, half time, and any in-game instruction, in-game coaching, say injury or natural break in play, that I see those three things as immediate opportunities to impart things that you and I are more expert on, and hopefully have a chance to accommodate some new information to benefit learning. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly true. I guess the caveat that I'd put in that, and this is just based on my experience, because I mainly work with players during the week, essentially. I think a lot of the hard work and preparation happens between the matches. So I see a lot of instructions going in play, for example.
Yeah.
And I go like, I'm pretty sure the player hasn't heard you. If he's heard you, he hasn't understood it. And if he's understood it, he might not agree with it. And even then, if he agrees with it, he might not actually action it for whatever reason.
And to add a fifth, if he's spending time thinking about that, he's probably switched off for the next action in play.
Right. And so, but I'm not saying in-play instructions aren't important. Like, they absolutely are. But I think a lot of their effectiveness depends on what you've done in the build-up to that match. So, for example, because time is short and crowds are noisy, you have to be concise as a coach with your language. But by being concise, you have to ensure they know exactly what you mean with minimal words. And therefore, that only happens in the pre-team meeting and on the training ground, agreeing that kind of stuff. So I think those periods are really effective, but I just find it really interesting of they're only effective if the prep has been sufficient. And that for me is the key window. And the hardest part of that, and I don't have a neat answer, if I did, I'd be far richer, is at the very elite level, there isn't much time for coaching. Like, you're playing every 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
Let's assume you're traveling for one of them and recovering for one of them. Once the season gets going, if you work out, maybe there's 1 day a week of actual coaching. And within that, you've got 30 players in the squad.
Yeah.
Whose time is, like, the coaching team is divided between. So how much individual coaching actually happens in football? I'd suggest not much. And one of the things that I think I was surprised at, but I'm not anymore, was football for me is by and large quite an individual game. Like, you play it with your teammates and you have a common goal, but you have your own roles, responsibility, ambitions, and therefore you have to have personal responsibility and ownership for your development as well, because it's hard for a club to give one-on-one individual development to each player. Yeah.
How much do you know about, or how much have you spent any time working in or reading potential research around American football, NFL? Because by my understanding, what they've had to do, given the size of they have 2 teams on the pitch at any given time, in the offense and defense. So their environment has necessitated that they have to separate the coaching at two different unit areas. And I wonder whether you can shed any light on that, or whether if you can't, how you feel about that as a mode of instruction.
Yeah, so 2 things I think, and I'm not an expert in American football, but 2 things that seem to pop up for me a few times is, one, you have specialist coaches and you have subset of teams. And a few years ago, it was quite funny for a lot of people. I can't remember who it was. I'm going to say Liverpool, but I'm guessing. Well, I think one of the first people to bring in not even a set piece coach, a throwing coach.
Yes, that was it. That
was kind of seen as like really funny. And before that, a few years before that, even a set piece coach or even a strikers coach would have, like finishers, wasn't the norm. And now you look at teams like Arsenal this year, who have clearly been working on their set pieces as a team. Having specialist coaches for subsets of players and for isolated events is now way more mainstream than it was. And I'm pretty sure part of that is down to the Americanization of the coaching. The other thing that I think is worth noting, just from a psych perspective, I'm pretty sure, have you heard of the Wonderlic test? So the Wonderlic test is given to, I think, all players before the each year when you're picking the NFL, like the rookies who are coming through, when you do like the combine and you're kind of assessing how they're each going to rank in the draft, basically. And it's this psych test to basically work out if you're going to be a good NFL player.
Yeah.
I'm almost convinced, I'm pretty sure it has no even correlation to scoring well on that to doing well in the NFL. Like, I'm pretty sure Tom Brady scored terribly on it as an example. And yet, so it's funny because you look at America and there's a lot of good stuff that comes from the professionalization of the sport. There is also a fair amount of nonsense. And a lot of it is still, a lot of sport, although it's very progress, is still based on vibes. Essentially. And that's probably because that sunk cost kind of stuff. I'd say. So on one hand, some parts of sport, and the same is true for Premier League football, is incredibly professional. And then on the other hand, once you're in it, you kind of go, this seems really amateur. And it's fascinating. So like, I remember I was working with a player who played for Sunderland. And he basically said, I was asking what feedback he got from his coach, really well-known, respected coach. And he's going, oh, he doesn't speak to me. Like, you only get spoken to if you mess up. That wasn't the language he used. He used a bit more colourful language. And so basically, if he doesn't speak to you, you've done a good job. And I kind of look at that and I go, like, my Sunday league team has better individual coaching in terms of feedback processes than that. But that's just the reality of some sporting environments.
Yeah, that is interesting. Approaches to feedback, I suppose, as you've mentioned, that coaching, that instruction requires time, and often at the highest levels of elite sport, time is rarer. There isn't so much of it. So
I've definitely heard of some players who they get their feedback, they get loads of like dossiers of their stats. They don't even open the page. Some of them will devour it, and a whole bunch of them won't even think of using that. So it's all about how it's packaged.
So what I'm interested in then is what the role of curriculum in education is. It's undeniable. It's unequivocal. We need curriculum to drive learning intent, to measure learning, and to hopefully deliver content in a way that sends adolescents out into the world. What role does curriculum need to play in elite sport, and how well resourced is sort of question A. And the subset is, you mentioned previously about instruction in play and actually requiring work having been done in advance. Well, I would consider that work to be part of a learning curriculum. So to what extent and how deliberate should coaches be when it comes to developing automation and mental models around that kind of stuff?
So, I mean, there's kind of two different parts to it, because for me, there's what you want to do, and then there's the reality of your environment.
Yes.
What I want to do is exactly what you described. Is I want to be able to help players have rich schema, is the technical term, mental models, that they understand their roles and responsibility, that they know how they learn, they reflect really well after a game, they have processes for that feedback, so regardless of if they've won or lost, they still reflect. One of the players once told me, he described match days, it's either every week, it's either weddings or funerals. Like you're either celebrating because you've won, or you're commiserating because you've lost, and there's no middle ground. But annoyingly, neither of those two actually lends itself to self-reflection, because you don't want these highs and lows. You want this kind of steady keel. So that's what I want. And maybe I'm able to get that more at academy level. Whereas if you look at the stats of how long a manager is in place, like when I started doing my research on it, I think it was about 1.6 years. I think it was about the average. I'm pretty sure.
Under a year now.
I was going to say, my guess is it's under a year now. And so learning takes time.
Yeah.
And we're talking about long-term development. Where's the incentive for a manager to sacrifice short-term outcome for long-term learning? And the incentive is there if you have job security. But if you know, if I don't get results in 6 games, and I literally think every manager is basically 6 games away now from coming under pressure, almost regardless of what you did last season, it's really hard to justify these big but long-term wins. And so maybe if that is the current environment, which isn't optimal, maybe it's a case of trying to find as many short-term quick wins as possible. They might not be as big, but they allow for breathing space, which allows you then to plan a bit more.
So where the perfect scenario is sort of you and I sat there rubbing our hands together going, right, okay, where can we layer in some space retrieval here, and how can we create learning around, you know, difficult schema of ball retention or transition, and yet the head coach is sat there going, yeah, we've lost 4 on the bounce, so you know that's
so
where I am.
I'm playing it long on the weekend.
Yeah.
Because if we concede another goal from playing it out, I'll get mullered.
Yeah, exactly. Although it got Vincent Kompany a job at Bayern Munich, so sometimes it can work.
Exactly, and I think it does take someone of very strong vision, values, identity to be able to go. I mean, so one manager once told me, like, I'm going to get fired whatever happens. Like that's how I'm going to leave this job.
Yeah.
I'm going to get fired. So the question really becomes, how do I want to get fired? Do I want to get fired being true to my values, or do I want to get fired trying to do it someone else's way, and then being really frustrated that I still get fired and I messed up this opportunity, which is a grim sentence, but that's a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah, it is. So what would let's go deeper onto the realities here. In the reality of what the game, and we find ourselves pretty centered on football, the realities of the game are as we've just described. So we cannot apply everything that we know that benefits learning in its truest sense, because it's not realistic. So what can be leveraged quickly?
By the way, I would say I think that is also true for education as well. Like, there's too much in the curriculum, for example, to effectively do stuff like spacing, where you revisit material regularly. So everyone has this constraint to an extent. I think as a basic start is you want to avoid information overload. I think that when we're under pressure as coaches and educators, the temptation is, I'm under pressure, I just need to make sure I get all of this knowledge in my head into your head, and I just want to kind of get it in your head no matter what. I'm going to throw stuff at you. You know the famous phrase, I'll use better language, if you throw enough stuff, something will stick. That's the opposite of how memory and learning works.
Yes.
If you throw too much stuff, nothing sticks, because you create this bottleneck, this overload. So I think avoiding information overload is an easy win. This actually sounds not what most people expect, but just ensuring players get enough sleep is a massively important thing for both how they think, but also how they perform. And I'm pretty sure most aren't getting enough sleep. So educating players around that, I think, would be very good. But essentially, the big challenge is, if the whole famous phrase that often gets used in cognitive psychology is that memory is the residue of thought, right? Which in layman's terms means you have to think hard about stuff in order to really learn and remember it. So where are the opportunities to A, avoid information overload, and B, get players thinking hard and therefore taking ownership and not just being receivers of knowledge, but actually receiving that knowledge and thinking, how do I apply that to my game? What do I need to do differently? And by giving them opportunities to do that, as opposed to just always telling them and hoping that they'll listen, interpret it, action it. Those are probably two of the biggest wins.
So if we put that into a meeting environment, that is, play the video and allow people to observe, don't talk over it.
Yeah.
Because then you've got, that's information from you and from what's being observed. Ask questions rather than just speak at, because that...
I mean, I think it is good to speak at the start. Like, let's be really clear. Like, if X happens, I want you to do Y. And there's no ambiguity, for example. But then I think you want to ask questions, because you want to see if it's what psychologists call transfer. So transfer is basically, can you apply that knowledge to different settings?
Yes.
So, for example, let's take the match that happened on the weekend. Arsenal, at 45 minutes, they lose a man, so they're down to 10. Can you transfer some of the principles that we were discussing when it was 11 versus 11, and can you adapt that to being, what do I now do now that we're a man down? And the beauty of that is you might not have covered that exact information in the team meeting, but because you've got players to self-reflect, to apply, to take ownership of it, that when then they need to do that on the pitch, they're better equipped to do so.
Yeah. And that's that, as you said earlier, the technical term schema, or just the ability to apply different learnings to different settings so that it's malleable.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, because there's no time in sport, you can't tell them what to do for every single variation that might happen on the weekend. I can't predict if our left back's going to do his ACL in the 3rd minute. I can't predict if the ref's going to send off a striker in the 80th minute. Or I can't predict all these things. So at some stage, I'm going to have to trust you to make decisions. So how do I enable you to make decisions? I can't just be too directed the whole time in team meetings. There's not enough time. I have to be clearer on the principles and then create situations where you can then reflect and apply them.
Yeah, and that is, as that speaks to my modes of instruction in a classroom. There are certain elements that I need to deliver as your knowledge base, and we need to make sure that knowledge is strong, is concrete, and then from there model how that is applied and synthesized and moved into different environments. The classic thing as we move towards year 11s and year 13s, come sort of April time, they will be asking me what I predict is going to come up on the paper, because their confirmation biases see me as an expert and think that I somehow analytically can tell what's coming up. And they like the idea of not having to revise everything as hard as perhaps they need to, because they've been told by me. But what I see as my job is that at that point, they see structure of a question. And that's the same as we're describing on the football pitch, or indeed any elite sporting environment. It's the structure, and therefore the different ways in which, the different modes in which that same structure can be moldable. So once I feel my pupils understand structure, so a question says this, well, we know that type of question always wants this. And that's the same on the pitch or in the sporting environment, right?
100%. And you can see the other very clear comparison between education and sport is the idea of like discovery and inquiry learning. So like, I don't believe that like the game, some people go like the game is the teacher, and we're gonna hopefully empower our players so much that we're gonna let them figure it out. And actually, I think what you actually get is rabbits in the headlight.
Of course you do.
You can do that once people have a strong base knowledge to an extent, and it's the same in school. If there are some things that you are an expert in, i.e. the knowledge, you have almost a moral responsibility to make sure everyone can access that knowledge. Because if only the smartest and the quickest can, then the gap gets wider. But it's more than just telling them. So you have to tell them at the start, but then you have to work out, well, how do I reduce that support gradually? That's the big challenge.
Yeah. And that's where the realities of some sort of assessment, some sort of testing, easy in school.
Yeah.
And I think in a sporting environment, probably a little bit of perhaps even questioning around that dossier you described. What does this dossier mean in reality? And is a form of assessment.
I'm wondering if, and I don't know, so this is just me kind of punting here, but I'm wondering if 5 or 10 years, that's the role that virtual reality is going to play in elite sport. So like, can I set up situations that you can literally feel and experience them?
Like a flight simulation.
Like a flight simulation, exactly. And therefore I'm going to test your knowledge, test your ability to transfer these principles into different settings, not on the pitch.
Yeah, I mean, that seems highly realistic and very likely, in fact. Interesting. Bradley, I really appreciate you and your time and all the work that you're doing through Inner Drive. It really is wonderful stuff and highly accessible. And for all educators listening, in fact, all instructors, sports coaches listening, head on over to Inner Drive. is it .co.uk?
Yeah.
.co.uk.
Thanks for the plug.
And access the dearth of resources, downloadables, one pagers, all the kind of stuff that means that it is highly accessible and illuminated, as Bradley describes. Bradley, thanks so much for all your work and thanks for your time.
Marcus, thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.